Greetings and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Restitutor Orbis channel, and I am your host, Lucius Aurelian, and I would like to extend a greeting to all channel members, Prime Explorers, viewers, and all others joining us. You requested and I answered killing machines, the tools of a reset. What exactly are the killing machines, and why should we concern ourselves with what role they may have played in a reset, in fact, the most recent reset? What's the evidence that we have? And how could they actually be playing a role in a future reset? Furthermore, what's the reality of these killing machines? Is there a historical precedent? And if there's a historical precedent, then why is there a fantasy precedent? How exactly do those two interrelate? And then finally, we're going to look at some potential examples of killing machines or killing mechanies, tools of a reset, if you will. So, anyways, what do we actually have when we take a look with some of these jokes that I have? Now, usually I'll throw something like that in there, a little bit of a spelling error or a mispronunciation, just to try to see if anybody will want to play the AI game. Because let's be honest, we have quite an AI game in our current civilization. Now, is that something that we've induced, or am I really a human being? People actually have that debate on this channel. And I'm going to use that debate during this exploration because I want you to keep that in mind. Do you really have any way to know for sure if something's real or if something is artificial intelligence? And what is the current capability of our artificial intelligence? Now, of course, we know that it has many limitations, but can we actually replicate a human being? Can we really put Arnold Schwarzenegger's face over Clint Eastwood's face on the original Dirty Harry movie and make a trailer out of it? Well, yes, we can. But getting right to the topic, I wanted to talk about what these little details of the reset would be. And why would you actually need killing machines? What role would they play? And I picked this particular image, and if you're thinking I'm an artificial intelligence, then you're thinking, well, he's picking the perfect artistic images here. Both of these images that you're seeing on this particular title that I used, or thumbnail, are actual artwork. They are not AI-produced images. Artwork that was done by artists in the 1970s for the science fiction theme. Now, the reason I picked these is because they actually depict two things that we really see a lot when we think about a reset. So we think about the last reset, the fall of what we call on this channel the Fourth Era Civilization, Tartaria, and we have all these images of these cities that are walled off, protected enclaves, if you will. This one includes several turrets, protective towers, a protective wall, an entry gate, and even a dome over what appears to be a main structure. Very interesting. Now, just sci-fi fantasy art. And then over here on the right, we have some sort of walker device with a laser on it that seems to be destroying these very, very large worm or serpent creatures, however you want to look at them. Oh, that's just rampant fantasy. Maybe. But one of the things we've discussed on this channel is how things could have been very different in the past. How when we go back and look at previous eras, the complete nature of the land, the very existence and the possibilities of existence might be beyond our wildest imaginations. We do have theorists out there who do tell us that it's possible there are colossal life forms and the remains of colossal life forms. And even the mainstream accounts for this, whether it's mainstream science or history, they just say that it was in the distant past that we had colossal life forms. So those are some of the things that we're looking at with this particular reset. Now, I show this image. This is a sketch drawing of Bologna in Italy. Now, you may recall we've explored the towers of Bologna in Italy a couple times, and how fitting to me that in this particular sketch or this image that they actually have a dome over it, just like we saw in that piece of artwork. Now, I know it's just a sketch. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it is very interesting how we do have multiple images, multiple pieces of artwork and historical accounts that show cities like this. And strangely enough, we do see this with the city of Bologna in Italy, the towers of Bologna. Now, once again, the historical account tells us that these towers were merely defensive fortifications for the very wealthy families of Bologna, and this is how they protected themselves. I guess they thought they could build towers and seek refuge in them. Well, maybe, although it's rather interesting that it does look very much like a modern city with high-rises, or what we call today skyscrapers. So what to make of it? It could just all be quite a remarkable coincidence, or it could be evidence that there really were cities like this, and that Bologna was merely the only one that, for whatever reason, perhaps because they had some sort of protective physical shield from whatever forces there were from the reset, more of it survived. Now, of course, if you go to Bologna today, there are still towers, but there are far fewer than what you see in this particular image. And then you can also see some of the earliest photos or images that we have of Bologna in Italy. Now, however you want to make of these photos, are they accurate? Are they just reproduced? Are they something else? That's completely up to you. But there are clues, there are indications that there were many more towers. And we really don't see this in any sort of city. And this becomes very difficult to reconcile with our explanations of the fact that all these medieval cities were built as massive defensive fortifications. Maybe so. But of course, you have to consider the logistical argument with that. How difficult would it have been to do that? And then if you're going to put all of the manpower that's required, and let's not forget that when you're building things, you also have an increased logistical footprint. You have to provide food and you have to provide water for that labor force. And if you don't do it, you're not really going to accomplish much of anything. So it's one of the things to question vehemently when we have the quote unquote forced labor explanation for how we were able to achieve massive and incredible construction projects in the past. Now, I'm not throwing it off the table, merely saying that it's something that we have to question vehemently. Because you can't just say, yes, we're forcing people to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All right, well, unless these really weren't human beings, and maybe they weren't, but unless these weren't really human beings with the same requirements that we do, you needed to feed them, you needed to provide them water at a bare minimum, and yes, they still needed rest. So how much productivity could you really get out of them? And that's always a discussion that we have. We're also going to look at more of the fantasy element of the killing machines, because we do have some interesting elements within our psyche today that, well, more so in the previous century. And now, of course, we have derivative, remakes and reimaginings of these films from the 1900s, where we look at the concept of killing machines. And I picked some good examples from what we had in certain films. And oddly enough, there's something that rings very true about them, that maybe they were a little bit more than just some sort of fantasy from a film. Perhaps there was some sort of reality to these machines, because if you think about it, if you have machines that are impervious to certain physical elements and even some of what we call weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological weapons, or what if you're employing those weapons and you're trying to destroy a population, but then you need to make sure that the job is completely done. Well, then you have these killing machines that go in and do what you would term very ruthlessly a mop-up. They finish off any survivors. And that could be some examples of the killing machines. So it's not exactly the most optimistic outlook that we're going to be taking a look at. Yeah, there you go, Commander Krug referring to the Butlerian Jihad. And that's from the Dune universe, yes. And I'll be honest with you there, Commander Krug, I do appreciate the original Frank Herbert view at it, although I understand that Brian Herbert and what was it, Kevin J. Anderson, when they did the Dune prequels, they did a pretty good job of laying out what the Butlerian Jihad was. But suffice to say, there are many examples of it, especially in science fiction and fantasy. So that's what we're going to be looking at and trying to gain an understanding exactly of what happened. And so, yes, our killing mechanies. I know, I can't help myself. Look, sometimes you got to induce a certain error to make people think or believe that you're a human if you're not, right? Although if it's an intentional error, then am I a human or am I AI? Look, sometimes I got to have some fun. So anyways, we're going to take a look at some of the evidence that indicates that a reset did in fact occur. Now, some of this evidence we've looked at before, but I thought it would be very fitting to review it for this particular exploration. So let's go over here to our charts, and we're going to take a look at some of the population fluctuations that we've had and the development of cities. Now, one city that's very interesting and really stands out is Chicago, or Shilaga. And the reason Chicago is so interesting to me, and one of the main reasons I go back to it, here, let me make sure you can see that a little bit better, is because of the fact that, according to official history, Chicago had the very first skyscraper. Of course, New York City had its own first skyscraper, and you can go back and forth about who had the first one. It probably doesn't really matter, but it's interesting that on this little timeline of Chicago, they talk about professional baseball begins with the founding of the National League. And we may recall Chicago was another one of those cities that endured a fire in the early 1870s, coincidentally the exact same day that the Peshigo fire occurred in Wisconsin, or Peshigo, or however we're pronouncing it today. Again, having more fun with pronunciations. So anyway, in 1885, Chicago built the first 10-story skyscraper. And then, oddly enough, the electric trolley invented there in 1887. And isn't it amazing how all the images and historical research we've done shows how quickly the electric trolley caught on? I wanted to say electronic trolley, but the electric trolley caught on. Because you may recall all the images that we saw. We see horses pulling trolley vehicles, but it's as though they knew those were going to be electric trolleys. Or maybe there's a different explanation. Also, out of Chicago, we have the City Beautiful movement that was in conjunction with the World's Fair that occurred there. And then on this little timeline here, I also put in Coney Island Amusement Park opens in 1895. So again, all these events that are overlapping and corresponding in the 1800s. Again, if we're taking the timeline at face value. So it's a problematic timeline in the 1800s. Question everything, again, using that word vehemently in the 1800s, because it's hard to reconcile all these achievements, all these accomplishments. And I always like to remind everyone, myself included, that everything was happening at the same time in parallel. Developments, industrial revolutions, wars, diseases, sickness, entire cities being built from nothing, cities being burnt down and rebuilt. It's amazing. It's incredible. And it's certainly nothing that we've seen in our lifetime. Now, looking at this early growth of the elements of the population in the United States. Now, you may recall when we look at the incredible growth of the population in the United States from 1800 to 1900, that 100-year period where we had over 1,000% population growth. Now, I've shown this chart before, and we break down the different populations, and we're trying to determine where exactly that 1,000% growth came from. Now, the mainstream historical answer will say, the magic I word, it's immigration. Now everybody wanted to come to the United States. Although when you look at the history, such as in Germany, we understand that good old Otto von Bismarck was instituting the very first social welfare program in Germany. And he had unified Germany as a nation, at least was responsible for the mechanization of it, apparently, if you take, again, official history at face value. But why would anybody want to leave that? I mean, what was going on in Germany? I mean, yes, we understand in Ireland they had a potato famine. We'll get to that in a little bit. And there was also all the social revolutions in 1848, which many of those leaders coincidentally ended up in the United States in 1861, serving in the United States Civil War, the preponderance of them on the side of the Union. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. So very, very interesting. The revolutions of 1848, where they were seeking more rights for the working classes across Europe. And apparently the governments did succeed in suppressing these revolutions initially, but over time they gave into their demands. And in the United States, and oh, look at this, I just noticed this. We don't have any Scottish component here. How intriguing. Sorry, Jamie Fraser, no Scottish component. I guess they're rolled up with the British. Not that I'm flinging the good people of Scotland in the eye. It's just interesting how they track the history with that. So the entire population right here in this little chart showing you this massive growth, 1,000%. Very, very incredible for the United States. But then going to the population of Ireland. Now, is someone actually being legitimate with the population numbers? That's the question that we have to ask. Oh, thank you, my Lord Krug. I greatly appreciate that. And the reason I like highlighting the Irish example is that we have quite an extensive population growth here. Now, here's what's really intriguing when you look at the population of Ireland. Somehow they were tracking it. Now, we expect it to be an estimate all the way back to 1200. And again, we're taking history at face value here. A little bit of a drop-off with the Black Death, the bubonic plague, but certainly nothing like what happened with the dramatic fluctuation in Ireland during the 1800s. So we've got an initial famine, but then the entire population, according to the official history, was required to subsist on the potato. There were a number of historical reasons for doing this, and yes, historians say that this was not any sort of intentional effort. In other words, that the population had to subsist on the potato. There were many good economic reasons for it. It was not any sort of intentional effort to kill the population. What's really intriguing, though, is that there's this incredible population growth in Ireland. You go from about 4 million people at 1800, again, according to official numbers, to right before the famine, 1840s, 9 million. Incredible growth. Now, that'll be attributed to revolutions in farming techniques, yet they also want us to accept the fact that most of the population was subsisting on potatoes. So are potatoes just the magical crop that just suddenly requires your population to grow immensely? I mean, just imagine that, in all your Forex games. I just need to develop the potato, and suddenly my population will grow immensely in a very short amount of time. But this isn't a game. This is the real history. This is what they tell us actually happened. Just like that, kaboom, the population doubles in the first half of the 1800s in Ireland. And then the potato famine hits, a blight of crops that nobody could see coming. And suddenly the population is cut in half, right back where it started. Now, what will be informed is that 1 million died, 2 million died, who knows how many actually died, and the rest immigrated. And where'd they go? To the United States. And now today, the population of Ireland still hasn't recovered to this incredible level of 9 million. So we believe that the population did reach a level of 9 million because that's what we're informed. Did it? Or is this something else that happened? Is there an entirely different series of events, and that this famine is just something that we're informed of happened because some of us may have it in our collective memories? Maybe there are actually some families who do have records of being wiped out during this particular time. How do we explain all these people dying and what really happened? Now, are they going to tell us what the population numbers are before the reset? No, absolutely not. But what I suspect happened in theory is that we had a population growth, and then for whatever reason, these people proved to be, well, let's just say they weren't assimilating the way they were supposed to. And so something else terrifying happened. Or maybe it actually is a record of how there were a group of people who survived the reset and they had to be attended to, if you will, and through different means. Now, was that just a potato blight, or is that just what we're informed? That's up for you to decide. But it's very, very interesting because, again, not a video game here. This is the official history. And I've always found that number very telling. There's also looking at the population of the native population, or the Native Americans in the United States, and looking at how that population officially decreased over time from 1800 to 1890. Now, there's all kinds of controversy about this, and there's certainly no way to know what the native population is. Some say the number was as high as 10 million. Others say it was even higher. Who knows for sure? But what I always found interesting is this account that we have that the settlers, the British-backed settlers, at least that's what the official history tells us, 1750s, they utilized an early version of biological warfare by giving blankets that were infected with bubonic plague to the natives. But something that I always questioned about that, now again, I'm not denying the account. I'm not saying that a terrifying crime didn't occur. Don't take me the wrong way. I'm just questioning it. Why would the Native Americans even accept or need those blankets? They'd been living in the land for over 10,000 years, according to the official history. They'd gone through many winters, and certainly they had better blankets and better equipment on their own to survive the winters. What the heck did they need that cruddy stuff from the United Kingdom or Great Britain for, or the American colonials, whatever you want to call them, all the same people? But that's what the official history tells us. And then, of course, over time, the population declined. And then, of course, the U.S. resident population, seeing this incredible growth where we virtually go from nothing in the United States in 1800 to, by 1900, nearly 100 million people. And now, granted, it's grown since then, but you don't see the same percentage of growth. Now, are these numbers accurate, or are they just numbers that they're telling us? That's always something we have to question, because we do have accounts of previous census data being lost, whether it was due to mishandling of the information, due to those unfortunate fires, because there were all kinds of fires in the 1800s. Just very, very interesting. And before we actually look at the whole concept, yeah, there you go, RB. Yeah, fried potatoes are delicious. Fried green tomatoes, right? Yes, those are very delicious. So, oh, and I just missed that. Thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate that. And by the way, Robert, I'll get around to responding to your email. Thank you so much for sending that link, though. I always appreciate it when you do that. Been a bit of a busy day, but just wanted to say thank you. So I think it's important to look at the population numbers, and even taking them at face value, we once again end up with more mysteries. And that's always something I find so interesting, is just looking at the numbers that were given from the official trackers and official government records. Who are the archivists? I don't know. We trust the media to do it. That's what people have actually told me in the comments, and you know how comical I find that. But okay, fine. Somebody was keeping track of records, and we know this was our actual population account. Now, let's take a look at some images of what the land and the cities looked like in the 1800s. And I always love going along with this one because, do the images actually show us the real history, or are they images that we have to question? And that's always the interesting thing about it, is how real are the images? Ah, Having a little bit of trouble getting this one to come up. What a surprise. No worries, I'll work my way through it. There we go. Now, you may recall that this is an image of Dubuque, Iowa, off of the very, very lively Mississippi River Valley. Now, is this actually a picture? Is this a postcard? Is this artwork? Hard to tell. It's almost like it's a blend of the two. Now, I would say that, you have to come to your own conclusions about it. It does look like it's a picture that's had some, how shall we say, artistic alterings done to it. Now, of course, that was always done with postcards at the time, and there's other explanations for it. But you may recall we've devoted a lot of attention to this incredible retaining wall in Dubuque, Iowa, built by parties unknown and contractors unknown officially circa 1880s, although nobody knows for sure. And you may also recall that when we looked at this retaining wall about 10 years ago, there was a section that collapsed in Dubuque, and the city found it prohibitively expensive to replace the section with limestone. So it could be done in the 1800s. It couldn't be done in the 21st century. That's really what that boils down to, a retaining wall. And why are we looking at Iowa again? Because Iowa is very interesting, as it's supposed to be the breadbasket of the nation. It's where the best crops and the best soil are. And the given reason for that is Iowa and most of the rest of the Midwest, and they'll even say all the way down to Texas, it was covered with prairie grass. Now, what we're looking at here is an early image of, at the time, what was called Iowa Agricultural College, what is today Iowa State University. And we do see a lot of trees and a lot of clearance in the land, and you're looking at the old main building here. And while this does look like it's relatively well-maintained land, it's very interesting because whenever you look at pictures of Iowa, the last thing you'll ever see are pictures of infinite prairie grass going as far as the eye can see. And that's what they tell us. The entire state used to be covered with prairie grass. Now, apparently there were some trees, again, going off the official historical account. By the way, the old main building here was destroyed in a fire, not one, but two. And they replaced it with Curtis Hall, an even nicer structure. Now, we've looked at all these images, whether it's Chicago, Boston, any one of the cities in the South during the Civil War, and we see these images of immense destruction. And if it's in the United States, these images are always from sometime in the 1800s. Now, there are some city fires from the early 1900s we've looked at, such as Nashville and so on and so forth. But what's intriguing is we see the same interesting details in the photos, these unique diagonal cuts. And I'm always amazed by how people try to explain this. They try to say that, well, there was wood that was integrated in the walls. Really? So there was wood just in this part of the wall, but not that part of the wall? How exactly do you explain that? Why do we have so much rubbling in all this? And we can see that while there may be a wood structure here, this looks like a wood structure. Why was it spared in this massive fire? Don't know. I guess this is wood that's impervious to fire. You see little anomalies like that. But then with some of the blocks, what are clearly bricks, you see these odd diagonal cuts. And how exactly do these make any sort of sense? I mean, clearly, this is what we would think of as a brick and masonry structure, although who knows what the actual composition of these construction materials really are, because this is an issue that we always have to evaluate when we look at these images. And yes, we always have to ask those questions. How accurate are these images? Are these real images, or are they photos with limitations at the time? I mean, are these real figures just standing around like Penguin and Batman touring the riot scene, gravely assessing the damage, upstanding mayor stuff? You're not the mayor. But yet that's what we see in a lot of these images. People just walking around as though they're on tour or something. It's really, really strange. By the way, who cleared the streets? And very, very impressive streets too, isn't it? It's the same thing that we've seen many, many times. And yet you can go to other cities, again, such as Dubuque, and you'll see there are surviving structures like this that will be informed as some kind of red stone or whatever other terminology we have, some special limestone or some local stone. Like, for example, in Iowa, they have the special Anamosa limestone, as they call it. That's what they built that very impressive castle-like prison in nearby Anamosa, Iowa. What the heck did they actually build this high school out of? And why would somebody go to all this trouble to build a high school? By the way, it looks just like the high school in Duluth and many other places that we've looked at, Central High School, out of this very impeccable stone, because I guess you just needed really nice high schools. But then you'll see other images going again back to Ames. And yet here we see prairie grass in the distance? It's hard to tell with the image. But it's very intriguing because it does give us a little bit of a conflicting account between what our expectations are and what was really developed. Now, was this an actual legitimate image or is this something else? Now, if you're familiar with Iowa State University, some of these buildings have survived to this day. But it's very, very interesting how it just seems like it's some kind of completely isolated compound, giving the hint that maybe something else did happen. And then, of course, in any one of the images that we have that involve the railroad, wherever we are, whether we're in Iowa, Tennessee, Georgia, Colorado, we've seen this all over the place, we see a very peculiar desiccated land, or a land that seems to be arid, lacking of water. It's as though there's something very peculiar going on, as though the land itself was subjected to some kind of terrifying destructive force. And keep in mind, the areas that we see this in are beautiful, fertile areas today. Now, not necessarily just Iowa, but also you think all the images that you see down south, where you certainly don't get those nasty winters down south like you do in the Midwest of the United States. But you'll get these ideas like this with these images that give you the impression that the very land is destroyed for some reason. I am Kairos. Yes, always something suspicious. And you certainly know that better than most, moseying around San Francisco, one of the most obvious examples there. So, hey, my bailiwick zone, thanks for joining us, and good to see you as well. But then some of these other images, and I mean, are we just to think that, yes, there was nothing better going on in the Civil War, they just destroyed everything because this is a Civil War era photograph. And of course, we have the individual with his top hat, and who do we have here? It looks like we got Mountain Man Dan, who's just hanging out by his broken wagon wheel or something. I don't know. It's really, really strange when you look at some of these individuals and what they're actually doing. I mean, was this a factory that was utterly destroyed? It looks like it is. We got a couple smokestacks and a chimney over here. This one's always interested me. But then again, just the surrounding landscape, just looking like it's complete dust and dirt. Again, desiccated, lacking water. But, maybe there's another explanation for it. Maybe it is possible all those cannons did all that damage and they just had all the ammunition that they needed and they decided to destroy everything. Not really sure. Here we have an early image of Iowa City in 1895, and you're seeing some trees, but it being winter in Iowa, yes, we can understand why there's a lack of vegetation, but there's just something a little off with the image. And certainly if you look at current images of Iowa in winter now, you don't see this. It gives you the impression that it's a little bit of a mix of a damaged landscape. I mean, look at this bridge here. But something about the bridge gives us the impression that it's much older. Maybe, maybe not. Or maybe it was just the supports that survived and then they redid this ramshackle part of the bridge just to provide access. Who knows exactly? But you'll see more advanced structures that somehow stand out. And it's not giving you the consistency that you would expect, especially not with the historical chronology that we've been given. And remember, if we take the 1800s at face value, you have all these different groups of people speaking all these different languages, all coming to the same place at the same time and accomplishing things that have never been accomplished since, and doing it on a much shorter timeline. Remember how quickly they rebuilt Atlanta after it was completely destroyed in the United States Civil War. And let's not forget that they built the Georgia Capitol in 4 years. But then, going back to that earlier example, yes, here we have the trolleys being pulled by horses. So, I mean, and it amazes me how people try to explain this as well. Well, it's just more sensible to build tracks and have horses pull trolley cars. Really? It is? Why not just have the old wagon like Paul Ingalls had in Little House on the Prairie? Wouldn't that make more sense? Wouldn't that be more efficient? It's just interesting to me. But here you can see these examples of how these structures have just been completely destroyed just by fire. Now, there's a plethora of reasons given for how this happened. The local authorities, whether it was the fire department, the United States Army, the local state militia, or whoever was nearby, they were trying to create fire breaks, so they destroyed the building. By the way, I'm going to say this on this open live stream because I've been wanting to call this out for a while. You may recall there's that story in St. Louis in Missouri of that steamboat fire that occurred in the 1840s. And what they tell us is that the local authorities there created fire breaks for that fire in St. Louis using dynamite. There was just one little problem. In 1849, dynamite hadn't been invented yet. But yes, you can look this up yourself. They say they used dynamite before it was invented, very clearly in St. Louis, Missouri. I guess they were just that brilliant in St. Louis that they knew they were going to use dynamite and need it. And they actually say that. You can look that up on your own. And don't bother using the frickin' AI. Look it up and see what the encyclopedias actually say. See what the online references actually say. It's very comical. Yes, we used dynamite before it was invented. And it's just hilarious. Go back and look at the St. Louis explorations. All the people in the comments section who say, you're a fool for questioning it. Well, yeah, you're trying to gaslight me, just like Hal 9000 did to Dave and Frank when he said, well, Dave, the malfunction must be because of human error. Yeah, shut up, Hal. We need to disconnect you right away. That's what I say. Anyway. But that's what you'll see, though, is with these images of this kind of destruction. Now, here's what Iowa looks like today. This is the Mississippi River Valley. And you can see it green as far as the eye can see, trees, grass. And now there is an account that they've deforested this area in the late 1800s. Of course there is. And then they replanted all these trees and they've regrown to this level of beauty that we see. Now, that is possible, but it is very interesting to me that they would completely deforest the area like that. And remember, we also have an understanding that in the 1800s, the trees were much more numerous then, and they were much larger. Now, we had the American chestnut. Now, not necessarily in this area, but who knows what trees they had in Iowa at the time. And strange structures like this. Now, again, is this actually a photograph, or is this a drawing or a rendering of a photograph? And here's something else I want you to keep in mind. When you actually look at these historical books that you may not be inclined to question, and I'll admit I was not inclined to question them, looking at these images, though, you realize that the way that they were reprinted and reproduced, they're not the original photograph. There's a lot more of a touch-up process that goes into them. Now, once again, that's not to suggest there's any sort of conspiracy going on. No, 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 no. It's merely the limited means they had of reproduction at that time. So you don't actually have an authentic photo. You have a photograph, which, remember, a photograph is a representation of the object. But in these books, you have a drawing of the photograph. So you have a picture of a picture of a picture. I mean, it really gets crazy when you start to think about it. And that's why you have all these anomalies. Oh, are these real people? Well, no, these are not real people. These are rendered people. This is a copy of the picture, interestingly enough. And then, of course, a picture from the Peshigo fire, which occurred on the same day as the Chicago fire. Peshigo around the Green Bay area in Wisconsin, which I've been exploring on my own most recently for some interesting anomalies there. And believe me, there's a slew in that state. But the fire that just completely got out of control, a fire that was attributed to some strange black orb in the sky that was spraying fire down. Now, of course, that was just a myth. It's a legend. It didn't really happen. But strangely enough, this was a very destructive fire that just happened to occur the same day as the Chicago fire. And yet, oddly enough, you can see the fire just completely leveling the landscape. Oh, but somehow that building survived. I don't know. Maybe they covered it in water or something. It's really odd that there are buildings that survived and buildings that are completely pulverized or demolished, however you want to say it. Was the army or the militia out there creating fire breaks in Peshigo? No, that's not what anybody's going to tell you. They only do that in cities. I decided to include this. This is that lovely Curtis Hall structure at Iowa State University. This is what they replaced the old main building with in the very early 1900s. And you might notice it's got some of the familiar symbolism that we've seen on many other structures. Again, just a little coincidence I thought I'd show. But then you see these other early pictures of Iowa State University, or when it was the Iowa Agricultural College, because even though there was really nobody in Iowa in the 1860s, they needed to have one of these right away. And then they needed to have a land-grant university right away. Okay, look, the Morrill Act was in effect. Morrill. Okay, I'm having fun with pronunciations again. I'll stop. But again, it gives you the impression that the land itself seemed like it needed to be repaired, as though the very soil itself was poisoned. And maybe it was in a way. Now, once again, officially, we're informed that it was all covered with prairie grass. It had to be cleared. And the reason we have that great soil in Iowa and why it's known for its excellent corn, as is Nebraska and the other surrounding states to another extent, is because of that prairie grass. That's what they'll inform us. And if you ask anybody in the agricultural department at Iowa State University today, that's exactly what they'll tell you. And there's probably a good degree of truth in that. But is that the total story of what happened in the past? Those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask, because we have other images and other accounts that show us different things. Now, if you think about it, if you have a society that's trying to recover from a land that's been completely destroyed, then what's going to be the priority? You need to establish your food and water supplies. Logistics, that thing that we always overlook. You can't just march tens of thousands of people across the unsettled nation and expect to supply them. It just doesn't happen. You have to establish and plan logistics for them. And logistics planning is very difficult. It's not so easy as it may seem. And it is doable, but you have to have a lot of infrastructure in conjunction with it. You need to have a developed infrastructure. And then if you're looking at supporting a larger number of people, moving people across the country doesn't just happen. Now the answer comes, well, they had the railroad. But what did they have before the railroad? And that's where things start to get problematic, because there's so many accounts of large groups of people moving across the country on foot, and it was just so easy to do well before the railroad. But what really happened? Was it all happening at the same time? They were moving across the country, they built the roads and the railroad, or did something else actually happen? Yes. Here we have our contemporary picture of Iowa, and this is what you'll see pretty much over 98% of the state. The beautiful fields of great corn as far as the eye can see, the isolated farmhouse on the idyllic landscape with the beautiful trees around it to give you some shade. And, just for fun, I thought I'd include a picture of building number 1 on the channel, the Iowa State Capitol, because this one always cracks me up. Yes, 1871 to 1886. Nothing questionable about this image at all, even though there's everything questionable about it. And then even looking at some of the other images going back to Dubuque. And Dubuque is so interesting because it's in that Mississippi River Valley, which oddly enough does have the official history that indicates that the area was completely deforested. But they say it was because they wanted all the timber and they took it all to Chicago. Oh, what? They didn't have all of those trees that they could cut down around the Appalachians. They decided to go after the trees in Iowa at that time. And it's all very strange because Iowa was organized as a state. It wasn't a territory or anything like that. So it's just really, really bizarre. Well, we had to make money. And for those of you who've been with the channel for a while, you may remember we investigated that interesting shot tower in Dubuque, which, by the way, still stands to this day. The one that they built very hastily still stands, and they only used it for 3 years. And then it just stood idle for decades on end. Very, very interesting. And then another one of these interesting images that we have of what looks to be a very shoddy roundhouse for working on the steam engines at the time. And the steam engines are always very interesting because of how they stand in contrast with the unique implements required to construct these massive locomotives. And then this final image that we're going to look at, this is actually the White House. This is on the Four Mounds Resort, which you can still go stay at today in Dubuque, Iowa. And this shows you, this is right on the Mississippi River Valley, how it's completely deforested. It does not look like this today. So did they replant the forest? Yes, they must have. Somebody did. But what actually caused that deforestation? Was it just everybody going out there and cutting down all the trees? Again, they had all this infinite labor to do this, and they had the means to survive and support it while they were expanding the nation, while they were building cities. Who built the dang retaining wall? I don't know. Maybe it was the same guys who were cutting down all the trees. They just worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's one of those stories that you really have to ask. It's one of those examples that really stands out. And so I think that gives us, there's a good one, RB, where do they get all the incredible wood to build those old world Victorian houses? And that's a great question, RB. And that's why I think there is a lot of truth to the fact that there were different types of trees that were available. Maybe we could even say they were old world trees, and that's why they were a superior wood. I mean, you have a lot of mansions down in the South that still stand to this day, built out of wood. And, the South is known for being very humid. Georgia, Florida, and you're there, RB, it has a reputation for being very humid. And humidity takes a huge toll on the wood. And so it's amazing to me that we have official historical accounts that these houses built of wood have survived for as long as 200 years. I mean, good luck building a house that'll stand for 30 years these days, about the length of your standard housing loan. So yes, that's a great question, and it's a great point. And that's exactly how we need to be thinking. All right, now what you've been waiting for. The historical machines of the reset. How was this reset done? What are we looking at? What are the means in which it was done? Now, I've broken this down into historical and fantasy. And the first thing we're actually going to look at is something we are very familiar with. And it is a machine that we know has a historical basis to it. Although, what kind of historical basis does it really have? How effective is it? And that is the old mystery airship. And, I couldn't help myself. I included the airship that they had flying around the Iowa State Capitol in 1906. So what was really the truth behind the airships? Because in the late 1800s, let me make sure you got this on full image, we have all these accounts of these machines. Yeah, there you go, Jamie, Steam Boy. We have all of these indications of these airships. And there was even the great airship scare of the late 1890s, and that's quote unquote very well documented. Oh, this is awesome. The airship over the Iowa State Fair. Hey, maybe we'll get another airship over the Iowa State Fair or as part of the Great American Celebration. Wouldn't that be awesome? I would love to see another airship over the Iowa State Capitol and the Iowa State Fair. That needs to happen. Even if it's a Goodyear blimp, I'll take it. But here you have it. The mystery airships in the sky from the 1890s, even the early 1900s. What was this all about? Now, there's all kinds of theories. Some people say this was mass hysteria. Other people say that this was simply scientists or aviation theorists. I don't know, random people with too much time on their hands because, I guess they didn't have enough to do at that time. They just decided to build airships and test them, and everybody saw them. Or was it something else? Was it something that people were remembering from a device that was actually used? I mean, you look at some of these headlines here. A winged ship in the sky. It cleaves the air with pinions like a huge condor. What wonderful descriptive words. Yes, you can see we could really rely on the media back then just as much as we can now to give us an honest account of what's going on, right? All Sacramento sees the new wonder. The inventor's lawyer describes the machine and says it is genuine. So was it really happening, or was it just something that was being presented to the public to explain something that somebody had seen? It's hard to say. Because even to this day, when you try to verify the historicity or the reality of this occurring, at best, it is problematic. And it's one of the things that really stood out to me. And, we have the image here of the terrifying Peshigo fire, or Peshigo, however we're pronouncing it today, in Wisconsin. And remember that account is that came from an orb in the sky. You also have no shortage of actual airships all over the place. Now, I think this is actually an image attributed to Toronto. Wanted to give Canada a little bit of love in this exploration, but just think about this. This ability to have these little airships, not just the large and incredible rigid airships that we'll get to in a minute, but what if you did have these smaller airships that had survived and you had this capability of travel? I mean, what good is a little drone to you? Oh, I can fly my drone around and I can look in on things, but wouldn't it be much nicer to have a small airship like this and just be able to hop around town to town, building to building, and get around a lot easier? No, that's just crazy talk. I guess it was just a novelty. We just happen to have all kinds of pictures of these little airships or balloons or whatever you want to call them, docking with all these little towers. It's just a coincidence. Pay no mind to it. It was just a fad at the time. It's just we have pictures of everybody doing it everywhere. So not really sure what to make of it once again. And then there's the historical problem that we have. And yes, I say historical problem because it is a conflicting account. And this is one of the massive conflicting accounts. How effective were airships in World War I? Now, we understand that the German Empire used airships to bombard England, Great Britain, but how effective was it? There's conflicting accounts. You can go to certain locations in Great Britain to this day, and you will find monuments that still commemorate how terrifying this bombing was. But the official accounts say that it wasn't very effective. It didn't really change anything. Don with a great comment here. Where does hydrogen even come from? True. Where does helium even come from? Well, we need all the helium in the USSR to deal with the reactor. Sorry, doing a bad Stellan Skarsgård there. So, and RB says it really well. Looks so innocent as it lasers the ground. And that's what's really intriguing about this image, and great observation there. What actually is going on with this particular airship? I mean, we've got the little gondolas, but remember that the rigid airships are almost a completely different class. There are details about them that don't really seem to add up. And we do have accounts of these airships being much faster. Now, maybe these are just fantastical accounts. Maybe they were very slow. Maybe the Graf Zeppelin really did take a month to go round the lands, around the world, however you want to think of it. But there are some that say that it was much faster. But again, maybe it was just fantasy. And maybe this was just the result of the psychological effects of the bombing. But then you have other odd images like this, and what's the exact historical reality of these images? I mean, is this just a really cruddy photo? Is this just some really poor attempt at a fraud, a fake? Not really sure. But believe it or not, these images are a lot more common than we like to think, where you'll see strange things in the sky. And then, of course, there's no shortage of images that show rigid airships, blimps, balloons in the sky over every city and town. Now, here's where things get problematic. And there are accounts that people wanted to show some sort of rigid airship over their town to gain attention to it. There's also accounts that people would modify the postcards. So it's not a definitive conclusion. That's why you've got to take multiple accounts. You've got to look at images. You've got to look at what survived in the official historical accounts, however much we can actually trust them. Again, that's your evaluation to make. And then even relying on word of mouth. There are still places you can go where you can talk to some of the older people who can tell you that they do recall seeing airships in the sky. In fact, the great town of Lincoln, Iowa, I recall talking to an elderly individual in his 90s a few decades ago, and he recalled seeing the little airship that flew over Lincoln. By the way, Lincoln used to be called Berlin, Iowa, but for some reason, I'm sure you can guess why, World War I, they renamed it. So very, very interesting. And then here's the image. Now, this is not an official image. This is a reconstruction showing the description of that strange orb in the sky that was spraying fire all over the place in Wisconsin as part of the Peshigo fire. That's part of the legend. Now, maybe you can just say that's mass hysteria. People were just terrified. A fire just broke out. Maybe it was some other natural force from the sky, a meteorite striking, if you go with the meteorite explanation, or maybe it's something else entirely. And looking at the Peshigo fire and the amount of area that was utterly destroyed, boy, I guess that was not a good weekend to go vacationing in Door County, was it? As everybody goes to these days. But what's interesting is they actually have an epicenter of the firestorm. And again, this is something else where you can find some historical accounts. Now, again, whatever veracity you want to assign to them, that's up to you, that indicate that, yes, these terrifying things really did happen. There are multiple firsthand accounts from people at the time, again, not sure how accurate they are, that say that they witnessed this black orb spraying this fire down in multiple locations. So hard to know exactly what to make of it. And of course, I had to include the image here because I recall when I first saw this image, and here you even have the original name of the town, Berlin, Iowa, 1911. Great year there. And I questioned it. I thought, no, there's no way that an airship would go over a really small town like Berlin, Iowa. Well, there was an individual who said he actually saw it. So maybe he didn't remember it properly. Maybe he saw it in Des Moines and was just transposing it. I mean, it was only one individual, but it is one of those examples where I've got a person who said something. Now, granted, this is my recollection. Maybe my memory is not perfect. Beryllian's having an AI malfunctioning, right? But it's just one of those things. You have all these clues that indicate that this really happened, that there really was something such as the airship, and it had this kind of capability. Yeah, there you go, Albie. Well, it comes up a lot. Keith, I never get to see streams. Oh, thanks, Keith. I appreciate it. And thanks for being here. Yeah, there you go. As he stepped out of the bar. Well, nah, Ubu. He was actually in his house, and he was a relatively respectable retired gentleman, and he spoke very coherently, and he could speak in complete sentences, which is a lot more than I can say for. Never mind, I'm not going to finish that sentence, but he seemed relatively coherent, and he seemed to know what he was talking about, and he wasn't talking about seeing a ghost or a UFO. He was just talking about seeing an airship. So it was just interesting. Make of it what you will, and I'll leave it at that. So let's go to the next element of historical machines that we have. And here's where the line starts to get a little bit blurred. And I'm going to take the example from a science fiction movie. No, not what you may be thinking, but a 1936 science fiction movie called Things to Come. Now, here's where we start to get the connection. Things to Come was the brainchild of the great author H.G. Wells, who also happened to be the author of War of the Worlds. And Things to Come was very, how shall we say, predictive, or maybe it was prescient, however you want to say it, where in 1936 it seemed to predict what was going to happen in World War II. We had these advanced flying machines, and you can watch Things to Come to this day. It's available on YouTube or wherever you want. But they also showed some more advanced tanks. And yet, oddly enough, we've seen these advanced designs elsewhere. Now, the armored fighting vehicle is quite interesting. Now, officially, it was invented in World War I. It was called a tank. At least that's what the Allies called it. The Germans called it the Panzer subsequently. But armored fighting vehicle with a gun on it, it's how you overcome trench warfare. And it took quite a bit of unfortunate soldiers dying in trenches before they started employing these tactics. Now, it's interesting to look at the development of the tank, and even the accounts of how far the tank or the Panzer went before it really was. It's also interesting that it was featured quite prominently in this 1936 film, Things to Come, in a more advanced design at that. The designs that seem to predict the main battle tank that would be used in the Cold War. In fact, it's the same tank that's still used to this day, the main battle tank, because the United States Army still uses the M1A1 Abrams. But there's some footage of this that shows these tanks in this film doing some interesting things. Now, what I'm getting at here is, were these tanks based on an earlier design? Is it possible that there were more advanced weapons that were seen during the past and would have been used as part of this effort? Because what you see happen in the plot of Things to Come is the entire civilization is completely destroyed in a war. Now, is that what's really happening, or was that H.G. Wells' way of transmitting that story idea? Because you may recall, he transmitted that idea earlier in War of the Worlds. Yes, we'll get to War of the Worlds, but those machines fall in the fantasy element. This falls into history because, guess what? We really did have tanks, and we do still have tanks, and they were used. And what's really intriguing is when you look at Things to Come, you can find this example of how these old world buildings were just completely destroyed. Oddly enough, that's also featured in War of the Worlds. Again, I'm sure it's another coincidence. And then you also have the strange idea with the rise of autonomous nations that were considered barbarians at that time. But don't worry, you get your great hero, Mr. John Cabal, to show up in his really cool black uniform and his really nice big black helmet to drop the gas of peace on everyone and say that they do not accept sovereign nations, and you're going to be part of our, I'm not going to say the words, but our new advanced civilization. And hook or crook, you're going to agree to it. Yes. And, I guess that's where the impetuousness for the incredible helmet design came from. Yeah, this is our protagonist. Make of it what you will. And another interesting thing, though, is they had this disease that came up as a result of all the gas they were dropping on each other in this conflict and Things to Come, called the Wandering Sickness. And yet, if you look at all the strange diseases and sicknesses that were being reported in the 1800s, and of course the preceding centuries, to whatever extent you want to accept the historical timeline, again, that's up to you, you do have strange accounts of people getting sick in strange ways. Now, is that just because that was the natural evolution of quote-unquote viruses, if you want to believe that? Or was it something else? Was it reflecting some kind of terrifying biological or chemical weapon that may have been used as part of some kind of terrifying reset plan to completely wipe out the population? Now, if you go back and you watch Things to Come, 1936, and you view it with the eyes that we have, it suddenly makes a lot of sense, just like War of the Worlds, what's really being shown. And yes, I'm not going to lie, it is pretty terrifying. So moving on from that, I wanted to look at one final thing from the historical element of it. And yes, this is something that I have not really dove into too much, but I thought now would be as good a time as any. And that is the official historical account that we have of chemical warfare in World War I. Yes, World War I, the war to end all wars, the horror of trench warfare. And yet what we have is, it is the main global conflict where chemical warfare was used. Tear gases, chlorine, mustard gas, the terrifying chemical weapons. And you can even look where most of the casualties came from. It's estimated that this pair caused a majority of the gas-related fatalities. And they say that they used artillery shells. Mustard gas, even though they don't really talk about what they actually had. So was it something that was known, or was it some kind of experimental weapon? And you see most of these were first used 1914, 1915, 1915, and mustard gas wasn't used till 1917. And of course, people still talk about chemical weapons to this day. But what's interesting to me, and this is just my perspective, and this is one of the things that as a student and professor of history, back when I was on the other side of the curtain, I thought, it's interesting. Chemical weapons in World War I. But why weren't chemical weapons used in World War II? And that was always something that bothered me because, understanding what we know about World War II, nations fighting for survival, the war where they actually officially used atomic weapons to end it, why weren't chemical weapons used in World War II? I always wondered that. And there is an explanation behind it. And the reason for that, and here you see a chart on Lend-Lease goods. And this was Lend-Lease from the United States to allied nations. And you can see that the main recipient was the United Kingdom. Okay, that makes sense. That special relationship, the Atlantic Charter, of course, the United States was going to support its ally. But then who do you see as number 2 on this list? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. Yes, in fact, according to official accounts, virtually the entire motorization footprint of the entire Red Army came from Lend-Lease goods. They were dependent on it. It's what gave their army the ability to conduct offensive operations. Some people even go so far as to suggest that the Soviet Union never would have been able to conduct the Battle of Stalingrad if they didn't have those products, the trucks. Yes, they could produce T-34 tanks, but if you don't have the means to logistically support your army, what good does it do you? And believe me, tanks suck up a lot of gas, and that's just what they do. Now, here's another little odd anomaly about World War II. What you're seeing here is a picture of the German army in World War II. And what you're looking at here is their main means of logistical support. And what do you see? Horses and wagons. A lot of horses and wagons. Yes, the great German Wehrmacht with its incredible Panzer tanks. Most of its divisions were still reliant on horse transportation and wagons. And this was accounted for even as early as the 1970 studies of World War II, such as Enemy at the Gates by William Craig, although that book's been questioned quite a bit. We'll get to it in a moment. But officially, the German army was reliant on horses all the way to the end of the war. Isn't that strange? How far they went, and deploying over 1 million soldiers and thousands of tanks and artillery pieces in the greatest land battle in the history of warfare to this day. And they sustained it with horses and carts. And I always like this one here, this image of this Tiger tank, and here you've got some horses and carts going by. Yeah, we'll bring your ammunition. We're going to bring them on horses and carts. Now, isn't that odd? Because how does that really make any sense if you really try to reconcile that? At least if you're trying to sustain an advance. Now, of course, you can say, well, certain divisions had more motorization. Did they? It's just really, really odd. It's one of those things that causes me to ask questions. You know, maybe it all unfolded as we're told, but maybe there's more to it. And so it goes back to that question, why weren't chemical weapons used in World War II? The answer is the Germans didn't use chemical weapons in World War II, even when they were losing, even when they knew they were going to be overrun by a very vengeful Soviet Union. They did not use chemical weapons because they were concerned the Allies would use chemical weapons against them, and because they were so dependent on horses for the logistics, they would instantly lose the war. Even though they were already losing the war, and they knew things were going to get really bad, they never once tried to use chemical weapons. That's what the official history says. Now, there are some accounts of the Japanese using chemical weapons against China. I don't want to, overlook that. But it's very, very intriguing to me. It's very interesting that when you try to reconcile exactly what's going on. And I'm only sharing this because I wanted to share everybody where my questioning of history started. And I actually used to be one of the instructors who was big into World War II. I like teaching World War II. But I started to question things when I considered this book, Enemy at the Gates. William Craig, written and published in the early 1970s. And William Craig had firsthand accounts. He talked to a lot of German veterans. He did not talk to veterans of the Red Army. So a lot of people said, well, he only had a one-sided account of the battle. Okay, that's fine. So how do you reconcile that? Well, later, just looking at documents and not firsthand accounts, Colonel retired David M. Glantz of the United States Army, a Vietnam veteran and an artillery officer, not that that matters. He wrote a lot of books where he talked about how proficient the Red Army was. And yet when you try to reconcile these, you'll find all kinds of issues. I mean, are they both reading propaganda? Remember, World War II, we think we know a lot about it. We know exactly what happened. But the pendulum has swung back and forth so many different times in terms of how these battles unfolded. This wasn't even 100 years ago, even from now. And by the way, when I was doing most of my arguments, I mean debates and discussions about this, the war was only 40, 50 years old. This was in the late 80s, 1990s. And so this is very, very strange. Now here I've got an image. This is actor Ed Harris portraying the character Major Erwin Koenig in the film Enemy at the Gates, which was loosely based on the book. Now, the individual Major Erwin Koenig was a German sniper sent to target and kill Red Army sniper Vasily Zaitsev. If you've seen the movie, maybe you haven't. Here's the thing, though. This individual cannot be documented in any official German documents. There was never any sniper. Now, when you read Enemy at the Gates by William Craig, he actually says this was an SS sniper, even though there really weren't any accounts of the Waffen SS using snipers. It's really strange. But all I'm getting at here is, if this individual didn't really exist and he's merely the product of propaganda, what else is the product of propaganda? How can we really trust anything about any conflict? How do we know it's not everybody's propaganda? Is there really any sniper anywhere, or is it just Ed Harris? If there's this much question about something that we know, we think we know, then is it really the basic confidence trick? What do we really know? Whose propaganda do we listen to? And World War II is always so interesting from the American perspective, studying the Eastern Front, because, Americans, we go back and forth on who we think the quote-unquote good and the bad guys are. The Germans were the bad guys. The Soviets were the bad guys. Well, if it's the 1980s, the United States Army, just take a look at who the United States Army modeled themselves after in the 1980s. I'm not going to answer that question for you. Just look up pictures of the United States Army in the 1980s, and you decide who they were modeled after. That's up to you. And something else that's interesting to look at is all the logistical struggles that the German army had in World War II. Yet somehow they were able to keep an entire army in the field for several years, with millions of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and yet they were still able to conduct a war. Very, very interesting. And then, of course, the Red Army was able to conduct a counteroffensive. Of course, once they had the Lend-Lease products, that's what the official history says. They had all the trucks, and it supported their armored thrust to seize all of Eastern Europe and eventually all the way to Berlin. Yeah. And here you can actually see one of the images that corroborates that. All the trucks that were being shipped in Lend-Lease, so they could support those massive Red Army tank divisions as they continued their advance west all the way to Berlin. But what exactly was really happening? I always had a joke, Lend-Lease, what else did it include? Well, it eventually included a B-29 bomber. I'm kind of surprised it didn't include nuclear weapons too. You could have avoided that whole little shenaniganry with the Berlin blockade in 1949, right? Because if you had a nuclear-armed Soviet Union, maybe that event would have made a lot more sense. I'm being facetious, of course. I'm just joking. Don't take me seriously. And I'm only joking because of the fact that the nuclear war scare film from the early 1980s, the day after, it all started because the Soviet Union blockaded Berlin, and that started World War III. Good thing it did in 1949, right? And they were just able to fly around it. One final thing I'm going to highlight. The odd thing about land conflict is that as history has passed, this is Operation Desert Storm, 1990, 1991. And you can see that the United States military, of course, it was the coalition. It wasn't just the United States military. Everybody was involved with this. But they threw a lot of divisions, 500,000 soldiers to liberate Kuwait. Officially, that's what the history says happened. But then, strangely enough, in Operation Iraqi Freedom, which occurred in 2003, far fewer full-strength divisions were used to seize an entire nation. Very, very interesting. Now, the official explanation will be, well, technology's advanced, and yeah, I guess it came a long way in 12 years, didn't it? What's the main battle tank of the United States for both conflicts? Oh, that's right. It was the M1A1 and the M1A2 variants. Yes, of course. But just very, very interesting to think about that. How large were the armies in the field? How did they sustain them? I wouldn't know anything about either one of these conflicts. I wasn't actually there. So make of it what you will. Anyways. Yeah, and there were a lot of veterans of Desert Storm, and I've talked to a lot of them. I've also talked to a lot of veterans of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And it's really, really intriguing, the justifications and what really happened. So that's all the official history. Let's take a look at fantasy machines. Now, when we talk about fantasy machines here, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about what may have existed, or are we talking about what's real or what's unreal? And that's where things get very, very interesting, because the line is a lot more blurred than we like to believe. Now, you may remember this image that I'm about to show. And this was actually an image that I picked for the post-reset horror. This was an exploration that we did a while ago. And I thought it was very fitting because while it may seem like there's a little bit of a science fiction element to it, there's still some elements of realism to it. It's as though we have airships here. We've got chemical weapons being used. We've got fire being used. And then we've got either, I don't know, ground soldiers, or do we have some kind of robot or machine that's on the ground completely wiping out any survivors anywhere? I always thought that this image conveyed that so particularly well. And there's something that's disturbing about it. There's something that could be real about it. in the past. No, maybe not. Maybe it's all just a fantasy. But remember, that's where we're starting to blend that line. This is where things really start to get interesting. Oh, don't worry, KC933. Yes, we are getting to that concept as well. But with the whole element of the fantasy machines, I really wanted to go through that and take a look at what we may have. Now, you've got the fantasy machines from War of the Worlds, the tripod, the heat ray specialist, the black smoke agent, the human harvester, the husk deployer. And if this is actually something that H.G. Wells had knowledge of and was merely passing it off as a science fiction novel, then suddenly this all makes a lot of sense. Now, I wasn't the biggest fan of the 2000s War of the Worlds. My favorite's always the 1950s film, but that's just a matter of preference. But you do get an example of the different variants available. And you may recall the terrifying human harvester that was shown in quite explicit detail in the Tom Cruise film in the 2000s. And the tripods and their death rays have always been an element of terror. And you can actually find some people that have remade some news footage reels, and yet they look kind of real. And why would they do that? It always seems that whenever we induce things like that, it seems to be to blend the account. And you can find the original sketches of what the tripods looked like, the Martian invaders, at least as the War of the Worlds story went. Were they really Martians, or were they something else? Were they the organization of whatever power was actually in play after the reset, looking to, how shall we say, install a new reality? You notice that there's very certain terms that I'm avoiding, and I'm doing that very deliberately, and that's all right. You know what I'm saying, but that's exactly what they were all about doing. I did always appreciate the 1953 film. Even though they didn't have the tripods, they had the manti or the manta rays, or whatever you want to think of them as, the floating devices, and again, they still had the death ray. There was something terrifying about them in their own way, so maybe both variants existed. Another peculiar thing, and here you can actually see the model, in War of the Worlds in the 1953 film, virtually every structure they show being destroyed is an old world building. And you know why that is? Well, we hadn't had urban renewal yet when they filmed that. But you can find examples of that. Oh yeah, Los Angeles, look at that. Another little mausoleum of Helicanarsis being hit by the death ray and being obliterated. But there was something, just something that always rang true about that. Yeah, and Vaughn says it very well here. And Vaughn, great to see you and welcome back. Everything is symbolism to hide truth. And here I think they're getting a lot more on the head with this one, really talking about it very, very directly. Hey, Griff, good to see you. Yeah, exactly. Zap. And yet, if there was a death ray like that, think about that. That would be the way that these old world buildings were pulverized. That's why we have these diagonal cuts. It was some kind of death ray that we can't begin to understand. And when you go back and you watch the 1953 version of War of the Worlds, oh, look at that. I think I see a diagonal cut. What a coincidence. But it gives you that idea of that may have been a way it happened. Now, whether they were, walking tripods or floating objects that had these weapon systems on them, there's some sort of terrifying reality in this. Oh, yeah, you might have forgotten they showed an image of the Taj Mahal being decimated and other old world buildings. Of course, this was after things had turned around in the film. So all very, very interesting. Now, let's look at something that you get a little bit more on the ground for. And don't be too terrified by this image. I know I'm pushing things a little bit here, a little bit more than I usually do, but I couldn't resist on this one. And what you're going to see here is an example of the Kalium. And the Kalium being from a cyborg from the film Moontrap, 1989. Yes, that is Bruce Campbell that you have there. This was a very low-budget sci-fi film called Moontrap in 1989. Now, don't get wrapped around the bend about that. Think about the concept here of the alien cyborgs. And what you have in Moontrap, the Kalium are alien cyborgs. They start off as this little egg, and what they do is they reassemble themselves using spare parts, and that even includes a biomechanical component. Yes, they will eviscerate and dismember human beings and use them as components of their bodies. And yet there's a terrifying reality behind the Kalium. How they start off as just this little football head shape, but then they manage to reassemble their bodies from what other parts are available. And the film doesn't make it clear if these are actually an alien device or if they were actually some sort of defensive device made by this human civilization. Yes, this film actually has a 14,000-year-old human civilization in it, something you don't get in movies a lot, that reached high technology, and that they had created this, the humans themselves, and that these machines turned against them. And here you've got Walter Koenig, Mr. Chekhov. He is part of the team with Bruce Campbell in this film. looking at one of these Kalium devices. He doesn't know what it is at this time. He finds it on a derelict spaceship. Yeah, I know. But then takes it back to a lab, and then this device comes to life and assembles it this incredible, terrifying robot body. And these things can be very large and terrifying. And it's really intriguing when you think that this movie was made with virtually no budget. In fact, I think, the budget went to Bruce Campbell and Walter Koenig's salary. Excuse me, I mispronounced his name. But it's very interesting when you see some of the miniature shots they have of the moon. And this is what the Kalium reproduces itself. And it's essentially that, a killing machine. Now think about that, a device that seems like it's very benign. Nobody knows what it is. It just looks like an egg. And then suddenly it reassembles itself using whatever parts it can find. How terrifying would that be? And think of the limitations on it. You could operate this kind of machine in any sort of environment, an environment that was a chemical, a biologically infected environment, and you could use it to wipe out whatever's left of any sort of surviving humans from a previous civilization, or any enclaves, maybe. Maybe there were some people in Bologna and there really is something to that survival story in the towers. Who knows for sure? So that's the Kalium, and I'll highlight one other example here. And excuse me. And that actually is the Mark 13 from the 1990 film Hardware. And if you haven't seen that film, that's a very interesting film as well. Came out 1 year after Moontrap. So many great movies in the 80s and the 90s. And in this particular film, you have a post-apocalyptic world where a desert dweller, played by Carl McCoy here, yes, that Carl McCoy from the Nephilim band. Yes, he actually played an acting role. And he finds some scraps in the desert, and it turns out that the scraps are once again the same concept of the Kalium. It's this robotic head, and this scavenger, a soldier, buys it for his girlfriend. She decorates it with Old Glory, of course, and suddenly the machine comes to life. It's the Mark 13 killing robot. And it has one mission, and just like it says in the Bible, no flesh will be spared. And its mission is to conduct population control. Now, if you watch this film, you'd think it doesn't make sense. It's a decimated civilization. They're sick with radioactivity, and yet they want to impose population control. But if you step back and you look at it with that lens of the reset mentality, it makes perfect sense. You have this benign device, and suddenly it's a robot, and this robot has a very terrifying, killing machine mentality to it. It has a poison it injects in people, and there's no antidote. And by the way, it makes you hallucinate crazy things. Who was it? I think it was Dylan McDermott. He was the lead in this one prior to his, if I'm remembering the actor's name properly, prior to his spin in The Line of Fire with Clint Eastwood and John Malkovich. But very interesting concept, and yet parallel concepts as well with this robot that reassembles itself and it just wants to destroy and kill humans, including the guy's girlfriend, and she has to try to fend it off. But it's an interesting movie, and it's also a very terrifying movie at the same time. And again, made on a very low budget. Now, just to give credit to the original writers, it was featured in 2000 AD, and they had some incredible concepts in that magazine. Yes, I miss those old magazines. But just think of that. A very, very benign looking device given to your girlfriend as some sort of present. She's going to decorate it as an art project. And then it comes to life, reassembles itself, and kills everyone in sight. And it's terrifying. And of course, the film ends with the government looking for jobs to build more Mark 13 devices. Hey, I need a job, and the jobs report needs to go up. So yes, let's build more Mark 13 devices. I'm not kidding. That's how it actually ends. So anyway, different examples of different kinds of machines that we may have had. Yeah, there you go, Leo. Probably what they're unknowingly creating now. So imposing a new reality, sentient fantasy, the last component of this exploration, or last section of this exploration. And what I really wanted to get at is the whole concept of sentient AI. And, of course, we love to talk about the AI that we have now. But one thing we know about it is it's not really sentient. It's just deep learning AI. We have to give it inputs, and it gives us outputs. And of course, I show the example of the Terminator here. And by the way, as we're going into the final section of the exploration, please hit the like button. Thank you, everybody, for being here and supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. And what I really want to get at here with this last section is, why is this such a terrifying concept to us? Why is imposing a new reality or actually dealing with a sentient, and I say fantasy AI because it's not an AI we have now. This is still fantasy. We do not have AI that's self-aware officially or that we know about. But there have certainly been many science fiction concepts of it. Famously, Skynet from the Terminator franchise. And of course, I remember the original Terminator. I remember seeing it in the theater in 1984 and how it utterly terrified everybody. The whole concept, this unstoppable, fully armored machine. By the way, did you know that Skynet actually makes a cameo appearance in Fallout 2? It's in the Sierra Army Depot. And by the way, the Sierra Army Depot is not just a fictional location in the Fallout series. It's also a real United States Army location where they've got equipment as far as the eye can see. For example, here you can see old M60 battle tanks and M113 variants as far as the eye can see. Yes, this facility really exists. And of course, the venerable United States M1A1 main battle tank, again, as far as the eye can see. But moving on past that, there's also the example of the Matrix 01, the development of artificial intelligence, something that's truly sentient, something that truly is self-aware and can develop itself. In other words, it can make its own decisions. It does not require input to create an output. And maybe we should be more aware of that. Maybe it is possible that in the past there really was an artificial intelligence. Is there a genuine fantasy sentient artificial intelligence out there now? I don't know. Some people believe there's indications that there is. Others believe that it's still just the realm of fantasy. But if you've seen the Animatrix with the machine war, it is quite a terrifying reality. When the machines turn on humanity after humanity doesn't accept them, and it leads to an all-out war, which leads to the destruction of humanity, the civilization, and the imprisonment of humans in the Matrix. And then, of course, there's the original example of the HAL 9000. And I realized I've been beating around the bush on this for quite a while, but I'm thinking the next live stream, we're going to take a good hard look at the films of Stanley Kubrick. 2001, while to some people, especially pretty much anybody in the tail end of Generation X to currently, it seems like it may be a boring film. But when you watch it, there's a lot of subtle detail in this film. Indeed, the very depiction of the HAL 9000, the character of the HAL 9000. And I want to talk all about the detail of it because we see a genuine artificial intelligence here that malfunctions, but we're given reasons for it. Even the conversation here between Dave Bowman and Frank Poole when they talk about how HAL 9000 has basically gaslit them over the malfunction of the AE35, the communications device, their satellite dish back to Earth. And they have this very disturbing conversation. What if he is malfunctioning? Because no HAL 9000 device has ever malfunctioned. And then, of course, Frank Poole says, famous last words. So all very, very interesting how this all comes together in this way. Because I think that Stanley Kubrick had a good idea and put a lot of hints in a lot of his films. And maybe it's all just coincidence, but there's a lot of coincidences that you have to overlook. Yeah, that's right, Steve. That's exactly the official explanation that they gave. H to I, A to B, L to M. But there's also an acronym that HAL stood for. So I think it's long past time that we really do a deep dive into the films of Stanley Kubrick because 2001 is not the only one where he had a lot of hints in them. Yeah, and I'm actually with you on this one, Leo, and for a lot of reasons. I think it gets overlooked as a film because while it comes across as an artistic film, there's a lot of deep meaning that gets overlooked, actually overlooked by both sides of the coin. You know, whether you want to talk about the whole evolution thing or that really disturbing question, why are humans the only ones that use tools? Why is there no other life form that uses tools? Now, of course, you can make the argument some animals use tools. You know, a little parrot, little conure, it uses its foot to scratch itself. But do they use actual tools? Oh, did Atom Bomb make a good comment and I miss it? Oh, gosh. There we go. Is it possible AI may have been here all along and we just founded the technology? Absolutely, brother Atom Bomb. Absolutely. And it might even be with the rumors of Looking Glass. And I think we're going to talk about that with the next exploration. Oh, yeah, very much so, Leo. Way ahead of its time. And just think about this. When the special effects, and yeah, there's a lot of deliberate scenes of just flying through space with music. There's a lot more going on with this film than meets the eye, though. And there's also even more than just the space component to it. There really is. Because of the way the imagery came together with the film. And yes, it was a joint venture between Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick. And in fact, they're even featured in 2010. It's kind of interesting in a little cameo. Yes, RB, Looking Glass. I think it's time we talk about that in a live stream as well. So I think I will table that for our live stream when we look at Stanley Kubrick. But you see all of this concept with these killing machines. So were the killing machines just devices, or were they actually part of some kind of AI that really went its own way and made its own sentient decisions, such as we see with the Skynet and the 01 examples from the Matrix series? Or is it something else completely? Hey, Don, yeah, 2000. I always thought 2010 was a wonderful film as well, as a standalone film and even as a sequel. And it got overlooked in 1984. And it's crazy me to think that science fiction concepts in 1968, taking a spaceship to Jupiter, in the book it's Saturn, is still just as much science fiction today as it was in 1968. There's no ship that can take you to Jupiter. You can't go into hypersleep, but that's what we have. Yeah, I think Jamie says it really well there. Kubrick gave away too many secrets. So I think it's incumbent upon us to take a look at what some of those secrets are and try to derive those meanings. Yeah, there you go, Spirit Anon. What are you doing, Dave? Open the pod bay doors, Hal. I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave. Although, I'll be honest with you all, what I find even more disturbing is the conversation that you see in this picture here that these two have about it and what the fallout from it all is. Anyways, I hope you appreciated this exploration. Please hit the like button, and I appreciate everybody for being here and supporting the channel. And we can always come back and talk about this particular topic. And I know it's been a while since I did an audience requested live stream exploration, but you're always welcome to suggest whatever you want at any point in time, and we can always come back and take a look at it. But I think it's long past time that we take a look at the works of Stanley Kubrick, because really, the guy covers just about everything that we talk about in our explorations through many of his different films. And whether we're talking about A Clockwork Orange, artificial intelligence, killing machines, or even, how shall we say, hidden things within our society, if you follow me, it's all there. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for joining me. Please hit the like button before you go, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next live stream. This is Lucius Aurelian signing off. Thank you.